What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and we're back for another episode of the fighting game tutorial series, and specifically the 3D Fighter. So in the previous episode of the 3D Fighter, we went over the 3D Fighter camera, which was a very fun episode where we implemented a camera for three-dimensional fighters. This varies from two-dimensional fighters because in a two-dimensional fighter we just have these two axes to worry about. We don't ever have to orbit around the characters. But we saw some issues with this, such as when we were using our 3D camera in 2D space, our inputs were reversed. Now we could still use commands by pressing those reversed inputs, which means we actually were working on the right side. Really what's happening here is we're in 2D mode, which makes some assumptions about where we're moving based on the direction we're facing. And so when we flip over here, the camera rotates around to the other side. But our 2D logic is still present, so it's reversing our inputs even though player 1 is still on the left in this case. I think since we are supporting a 2 and 2.5D fighter and a 3D fighter though, we should have separate camera variations. That way whenever I want to make a change to the code or to the logic, I don't have to check and see that they're using a specific camera. I don't have to confirm with them that they've watched a certain episode from the 3D fighter as opposed to the regular fighter series. So in today's episode we're going to be splitting up the logic. That way we support both the 2D fighter camera and the 3D fighter camera. So even though you could use one camera for both, and I think that's pretty neat, for the purposes of the tutorial series in supporting both these fighter types, I think it's perfectly reasonable to split up these two camera variations. Now the other thing we were seeing when we went to the 3D fighter mode is that as we walked into the character, we started to rotate around them, and eventually when we got to the other side, then our movements were reversed as well. And this is technically a different issue. It's very similar. There's a lot of similarities because as we go over here, our inputs get reversed, and moving right is part of that. So our 2D logic is still in use while we have our 3D fighter, so that's part of it. But there are also some things we can update on the 3D movement side to fix this. Now this issue specifically we're not going to be fixing today. That will be the next episode. So both these issues are going to have their own episode. And once we get both these things fixed, then we're ready to determine how we do side swapping with our 3D orbit camera. And from there we can customize it to our liking. But at that point we will have a working 3D camera. And so we're really pulling it all together here. We're getting quite close to having a functioning 3D mode. So that's what we're going to be going over in today's episode. If you're interested in getting caught up in the entire fighting game tutorial series, so you can check out how we've done things like our attacks, our different modes, our input stacks, and a whole lot more, I'll link you to the entire fighting game tutorial series right here in the top right corner so you can see every episode. And there's more episodes every Sunday. Alternatively, if you're just interested in 3D fighters, you don't have to watch the entire series of the fighting game to follow along with that. However, many of the concepts are useful and are relevant. I will link you to the first episode of the 3D fighter conversion of the 2 and 2.5D fighter to 3D in case you're interested in making a 3D fighter of your own. Now with that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series. We're going to be doing everything in LeetCode today. And it's going to be a very simple episode. We really are just restricting some things from happening in 3D mode and allowing some things to happen in 3D mode. But again, I think it's an important episode to separate this logic so that we don't start mixing the series too heavily where the 3D fighter becomes required for the regular 2 and 2.5D fighter episodes. That is not what I wanted, so we're going to avoid that. Now let's start off by going to Visual Studio, or our IDE of choice. And then in the code, we can go to our base camera CPP and basecamera.h files. So I will start in basecamera.h. In this class, we were doing all of our logic for our camera movement in tick. We have some boundaries that we set up, and we determine if the camera should move at certain points, but really all of our movement is in tick. So I want to have a function that handles the 2D camera behavior and a function that handles the 3D camera behavior. That way we can call these in tick depending on the mode the user has chosen. And that way we don't have this huge tick function with two different methods. So I'm going to go to where my functions are. In the bottom here, right above tick will work. And we'll say update the camera's transform, which is the location, rotation, and scale in an Unreal context. Basically just where it's positioned and which way it's looking based on two-dimensional rules. And then we'll say void update camera 2D. Then let's have a function update the camera's transform based on three-dimensional rules. Void update camera 3D. Very, very simple logic here. And then we can go to base camera CPP and make these two functions. So previously in the 3D Fighter episodes, I had two versions of tick. This is the current version that I have been using, and this is the 3D Fighter version. But right below that, we have our commented out 2D Fighter version. This is what we were using in the regular 2 and 2.5D Fighter episodes. For today's episode, I basically just want to make these two functions and call the corresponding function depending on the mode we're on. So void a base camera, update camera 2D, and void a base camera, update camera 3D. And then when we come into our 3D tick function here, I can take everything that's in here except for the super : tick. That's just the call to the parent function. Copy it and paste it in update camera 3D. So now update camera 3D is doing all the logic that the 3D version of tick was doing. So to replace it, we can simply call update camera 3D. But this isn't really all we want to do. I also want to be able to use this 2D logic. So if I come in here and copy everything that was commented out in my 2D fighter, and to make this even easier to read, I can just uncomment this tick function right here. That is Control KU for me to do that shortcut, but you can just remove the comment, and then I can copy everything in here except the super : tick, and we can put it in update camera 2D. And now we have two different variations of the camera movement. We don't need two versions of tick. In fact, we can't really have that, so we can get rid of one of them. And now we can call update camera 2D. So now we're calling both of these functions in tick, which is good. However, we really need to only call one based on our mode. So what we need to do at this point is get our variable that determines that, which is called isFighter3D. We use that a lot in our fighter template character class to determine our movement and such, but we haven't used it in our camera yet. So to do so, we need our game instance. And to get our game instance, we can say if auto base game instance equals cast ubase game instance. And we're casting get game instance. So we're getting the game instance from Unreal, the active game instance, and we're casting it to our ubase game instance, which is the class that has that boolean for if fighter mode is 3D or not. So if we scroll down here, is fighter mode 3D? So once we cast this, we set it equal to this variable. If this variable is valid, that means that we were able to cast the game instance to this type, which means it exists, which means we can use it. So we will go into this if statement. Otherwise, if we can't, then we'll skip this if statement. But if we can go into this if statement, then I will say base game instance is fighter mode 3D. And we can put this in an if statement, because if it is, we want to call update camera 3D, and if it's not, we want to call update camera 2D. And this is pretty much all we need to do to accomplish this, but you may want to have a fallback as well. So basically, if it is fighter mode 3D, use this one, but otherwise my default is going to be update camera 2D. I could put it in an else statement, so if our base game instance is not able to be grabbed for any reason, we can use the 2D version of the camera. I'm not going to do that. If anything, I would put a log in here, because really I want to make sure that this is always valid for our game, and then we can do the corresponding logic. It's very, very simple, but we can add a comment if we want. If this is a 3-dimensional fighter. And there we go. And now the editor is back open. So if I come into my game, we can say versus or practice, doesn't really matter. Then I come in here and I jump over my character, and everything is working as expected from my 2D camera. When I crouch, there's no weird height adjustment or anything like that, and things are working well. I should be able to do everything with my camera boundaries, and it looks like I can. I can launch them. I can jump off the walls. Everything's going well. Now when I convert to my 3D fighter, I can rotate around them, and my 3D camera is definitely being used. It's working wonderfully at this point. And if I turn this back to false and go back to my 2D fighter, then my 2D camera is working again. So our camera is being used for both the 2D and the 3D fighter, and it's working quite well. So one thing you probably noticed, but I'm going to launch again and just show you. When we come into the game here, our flipping is working well on our characters. When I swap to 3D mode, the character on the right ends up switching and rotating around the wrong direction. Now the reason this is occurring is because we had manually modified the rotation that is applied to the characters in three-dimensional mode because of an incorrect value. And that incorrect value was something we fixed a few episodes ago, where the arrow component on the character, which determines the direction the character was facing, in your character blueprint it looks like this. So you see that little blue arrow on the back here. To this point, since we weren't doing a 3D fighter, this didn't have to line up with our character. We could get around it. But now we're doing some math for our movement based on which direction we're facing and things like that. So now that we have the 3D camera showing this as well, it is easier to diagnose this problem. So we can go back into the code and go to fightertemplate_character.cpp. So I believe the function is rotate toward opponent 3D, which we can search for it. I did just before this, but I want to make sure I have the name right. So rotate toward opponent 3D. It's toward the bottom of my file here. And basically we were seeing if there was another player, and if there was, we were using the controller's rotation. Then we were disabling orienting the character to the movement, which was important because if we were moving a certain direction, the character was trying to turn that way, and we didn't want that. We wanted to always have the characters look at each other. Then we were finding the look at rotation with a ukismet math library function, find look at rotation. And then we were setting the controller's rotation to that look at rotation. So one thing we can do to fix this is scroll down to our tick function, because what's causing this issue is where we were changing our scale, inverting it for the 2D mode. Even though we rotate the characters toward each other, the scale is still inverted for the character that is flipped or is not facing right. So if we take this whole section where we're checking for if the character mesh is valid and then inverting the scales, we can make this work. Now I don't actually recommend keeping this in here. I'm just showing you this is the issue and we can solve it this way. But the reason I don't recommend keeping it is because rotate toward opponent 3D is called every single time that tick runs, which is every single frame. And this is a lot of extra work happening every frame. So we will have a better solution to this, and it's going to tie into what we do for our movement. So I'm not really going to show you a full solution now because that's for our next episode. The things I was mentioning earlier where we have to calculate our movement in 3D, ignoring the is facing right stuff in our 2 and 2.5D fighter. But feel free to test this out so you can see it working, and if you want to use it in the meantime, then you're definitely able to. So editor is back open, and now we can go and do versus another time. And 2D, looking good. Of course, rotate toward opponent 3D is not used when we're in 2D mode. You'll notice with these changes in the 3D fighter mode, the characters are oriented properly. So the character on the right does rotate around to meet the character on the left, and same with the character on the left like it was before. As I mentioned, that was the issue. I'm going to take it out on my end, and we'll implement the proper fix for it next time, but I just wanted to show that to you in case you wanted to use it in the meantime and learn more about why that was an issue. If your game is not going to be a 2D and 3D fighter and it's only going to be one or the other, so only 2D or only 3D, you don't need to implement a lot of the behavior in this episode. However, if you want to follow along with both the series, just make sure that you know that now we have the 2D camera and the 3D camera, and we can edit them separately when we want specific logic to occur in that specific mode. This will make it much easier to edit going forward. So editor is back open, and now we can go and do versus another time. And 2D, looking good. Of course, rotate toward opponent 3D is not used when we're in 2D mode. Appreciative, and so glad you're enjoying the channel. If you want to support the channel and myself further and get some benefits along the way, you can check out Patreon, YouTube membership, and Discord subscriptions. If you ran into any problems following the tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. There is a link in the description, and I would be happy to help you out. The support is completely free. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.